Welcome, everybody, to episode 22 of the Arch City Poker Podcast. My name is Tony. Alongside Nick, we own, operate, and run ArchCityPoker.com. Nick, how are we doing today?
Doing great.
Awesome.
Excited to be here as usual.
Yeah. Another week, another podcast. If you didn't catch last week's episode 21, go ahead and follow the YouTube channel that you're already on. It's going to be one of the previously uploaded videos. Go ahead, like, share, and subscribe, or leave a comment. Tell us what you think. Maybe how we can improve, what you liked, what you didn't like, anything, any feedback is great. We'll take it, we'll run with it, and continue to work to produce content that is well loved by all. And Nick, today we have a topic that I think is really important. I think we've talked about it a handful of times loosely over a bunch of different podcasts, but basically we haven't had a topic about it. And the topic is a little ominous, but we're going to explain kind of what it means and kind of deep dive into it. But it's basically stop playing perfectly and start playing profitably. Again, this is highlighting live low stakes 1-2, 1-3, maybe some 2-5, right? So maybe some like low 1-2, 2-2 PLO, that kind of stuff. So basically what we're talking about when we're saying stop playing perfectly, start playing profitably is live low stakes poker is by and large a very exploitive game. You don't have to play as balanced, as GTO, as perfect as maybe you hold yourself to the standard of. And we've covered like what a little bit of like GTO, like we usually say like we're not going to get into what GTO is. We're not going to talk about being balanced. In this episode, we are. We're going to talk about like why and when it is okay to be balanced, and why at live low stakes, why aren't we trying to be like Captain GTO and have the perfect line with the perfect hands against the perfect bet sizes against the, against the villains. We're going to be playing exploitatively, which is going to be identifying the mistakes that our opponent is making, and we just hop on top of it. We're not trying to be balanced and betting the same with all of our hands, that kind of stuff. So Nick, when you think about live low stakes, and we talk about maybe somebody playing balanced or maybe playing solid, and we compare that to somebody playing exploitatively, what would you say the difference between those two theories are?
Balance, simply put. I mean, with GTO, it playing like an equilibrium, showing up in spots with the ability to have, let's say, like air, but then have like the nuts, polarization, all that fun stuff. I think as far as like the low stakes games, I mean, it's kind of already like embedded in the title of this episode, I guess. But players are definitely, at least the guys that are like the tryhards, so to speak, the guys that like actually care about getting better. And if you're listening to this podcast, I think there's a really good chance you're one of them. But there's too much of an emphasis put on making the right play and not finding the best play. And the best play 99% of the time is probably going to come from, an exploitative strategy or line or perspective, if you will. But yeah, Tony, I mean, I always over the years have said that if you have at least some kind of understanding of like baseline GTO, like if you understand, I don't mean like, looking up like a hand and a solver and memorizing like a chart, so to speak, or a solution, if you will, but more like why would you be more polar in position? Why are you balancing your check back range? Like if you know the really, like I would say like the macro stuff about about GTO, like equilibrium, it does help you understand why you're exploiting somebody in a low stakes game. It helps you more efficiently, clarify ranges and figure out where somebody's at and understand that when they're deviating away from what the solver would probably say, then you can exploit them, obviously more efficiently. So yeah, it's about balance, and we don't need it in the low stakes games.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I would say there's always maybe one or two people at a table that I'm playing at that maybe they talk about it when, you've had those people at the table that have a comment for the way everybody plays. And usually they're the more aggressive players at the table. and they just seem to tell you that you're playing good, you're playing bad. They mock bet sizes, they do XYZ, and that might come from some little study they did with a GTO solver, so they think that they know what in theory is correct, or maybe ballparking it a little bit and just kind of going off the cuff. But I would say by and large, I think that there's just a lot of people who misunderstand what GTO is and how it's applied to live low stakes. And I think if you're somebody listening, you've probably watched live streams from casinos or card rooms. You've seen the World Series of Poker commentary. I mean, any big tournament commentary. The topic of GTO, even in like YouTube vloggers, is pretty prominent. And I guess maybe at some of those like higher stake vlogger games, like sure, that could be a thing, even though the lineup is bred to be a little bit more aggressive. So I'm not quite sure GTO is the right strategy in a game lineup like that. But yeah, overall, Nick, I think you nailed it right on the head. So if you're talking from like a player pool perspective, what do you think that most players are misunderstanding on what it like really means to be balanced?
I would say in general, honestly, like I just hear players say, like so here's the funny thing, like they'll take a line, um, and they will justify after the fact by saying, and it could be a play that they could perceive to be bad, or maybe they perceive that the table thought it was bad. A lot of times, like what I'm getting at is like they will have a pretty speculative hand, like a starting hand, and then they'll perhaps like quote chase down a draw, right? And the justification after the fact will be, well, you got to mix it up. And so I think that a lot of the guys that know, like, I don't even know if they know like what they're saying as far as like if it's a GTO thing, but it's more just like being predictable versus unpredictable. And I think that's how most of the live low stakes players think about it, if they do think about it at all. Um, if you get some of like the more try hard guys that you hear talk about like ranging somebody, I mean, I don't know if I would say there's necessarily like it's hard to say like where there's a specific misunderstanding. I would say in my professional opinion, it usually comes with a combination of frequency and sizing. And sizing's like the big one, but frequency also. Like there are spots where I think players are incredibly passive compared to what they should be. Like for example, an out of position check raising range. That's one that I would say 99% of the pool misses. Like they just don't have enough hands in there, whether it's no limit or PLO. Another one could be, yeah, like I mentioned it before, like a check back range and protecting that. Like there's, I think, a lack of an understanding there. So like there's a lot of specific spots that I could probably point out, like more of the bread and butter spots. But I would say in general, it's just like, I think there is like an understanding that like there needs to be a semblance of balance or unpredictability, but I don't think they like what ends up happening with theory is like a lot of guys will, they'll look at like a training site or they'll get coaching from an instructor or they'll just be on like platform like this, like YouTube, and they might understand it on some level, but applying it, like making it applicable is a whole nother thing. And so I think trying to apply GTO theories is something that's completely misunderstood. But yeah, then Tony, there's obviously little like nuances, if you will, within that GTO realm or framework where players are probably making a ton of mistakes because they don't completely understand like why the solver would suggest taking an action.
Yeah, I think you nailed a lot of stuff. And I think the like a big misunderstanding is like people think that balance is like about protecting your range, right? I think that's like probably a pretty common thing that most people would think. But I also would argue that most of the player population don't understand like the dynamics of who's attacking the range that they are representing. And in addition to that, at live low stakes, nobody is tracking your frequencies. Like, no, nobody is. Maybe you have one person who's kind of just watching you intently because maybe you're one of the more aggressive players in the game. But I think by and large, I think that people just try to like you hear people say all the time, like if you act like you got aces, like you just got to act like you have it. Which I mean, kinda. I mean, that's kind of like the baby steps to what being balanced is, but like nobody's watching you that intently to understand that how many times you're opening an orbit, what your bet sizing is every single time you open. Are you leading like unless you're doing some pretty unstandard stuff like you're leading multi-way into a lot of people for a lot of money, you're check raising a ton, that kind of stuff people remember because it makes them feel something. When people aren't involved in a hand, they're traditionally just sitting down looking at their phone, they're doing Lord knows what, but they're not paying attention. If they're not feeling anything, they're not remembering anything. But I tell you what, Nick, when you and I are in a hand and I'm electing to lead on a low monotone board for whatever reason, I'm deciding to lead, and then you check raise me for a lot of money. I'm feeling a lot of things. I'm feeling like now I have to like put my brain to work. Like, what kind of hands is he doing this with? Has Nick been doing this to me often? Is he bullying me, right? Or just I'm getting emotionally invested into the hand because it's making me use my brain. And I think that unless you're doing that to particular players, they're by and large just not paying attention to you. So, but yeah, Nick, I think I mean you're nailing basically all these topics head on. Maybe you are the king at this kind of stuff. But if we're going to go the opposite direction and we're talking about exploitive play versus like being super balanced, or maybe we have questions about how balanced the live low stakes player population is, we would encourage players to adopt a more exploitive strategy. And when we say that, how far would we want them to lean exploitive, like lean into it, versus leaning into a more balanced strategy?
All the way. I think until honestly it's proven that you have to deviate back or like regress to the baseline, I think you should absolutely disrespect your opponents. And I used to this would have been a leak of mine back in the day a little bit where I would respect them honestly too much, all the way up into like 5-10 pools, depending on again like where you're at, what city, what room, etc. Like, because a really good 5-10 pool could exist, but generally speaking, they're still like you can still exploit them to the max. And so, yeah, I used to fall victim to that, and I would probably overly respect my opponents, and there would be some spots where I would implement like some balance or some GTO stuff. Um, but yeah, any player that would ask me that question, or any of you guys that are listening now, I would say you take it to a level that is even maybe uncomfortable for you, as far as like you think it's really obvious, like it could be incredibly obvious to like the dumbest player you're playing against. But I think that there's two things kind of going on with that. Like, one, is your opponent capable of understanding, like are they actually figuring out if you're not balanced, or if you're predictable, or playing exploitively in a spot? But two, and this is the biggest one, is are they capable of doing anything about it? Can they counter it? Do they know how to counter it? Some players will play back at you in spots. Like there will be spots where they do things, or they play back at you aggressively, but I would say a vast majority of the time they aren't implementing it correctly, or they don't know, like they know they just have to do something, but they don't know like when, how, or why, if that makes sense. But yeah, take it to the most max level you can. And am I saying now necessarily, like, I'll give you an example pre-flop. Like, am I saying if you guys have pocket deuces, you should either limp or make it like a min raise so you can get in with like a weaker hand, but like a cheap hand to speculate with, and then you make it like much larger with your aces? I'm not saying that necessarily. Like pre-flop, we will have sizings where we kind of do balance everything, but I am saying that if you come over to artshitypoker.com, like there will be spots, for example, where like especially post flop as the streets progress, or you progress through the streets, if you will, there will definitely be spots where we're splitting our sizings based on how we ranged our opponent and what we want to accomplish with our hand and how it relates to his range, that type of thing. And it is very exploitable. But like I said, 99% of the players you play against are not capable of countering or doing anything about it. So there's way too much money being left on the table. If you're implementing GTO, there's way too much money being burned if you're implementing GTO. If a nit makes it 5x and then you take king 6 suited and 3-bet him like button versus cutoff or something, like you're burning money because the nit has a really strong range. Like he doesn't have a GTO cutoff opening range. So that's kind of just like an easy example of that. But yeah, Tone, I would say as much as you can, exploit until it is absolutely proven that you need to respect that opponent.
Yeah. I wholeheartedly agree with you. I always told myself, like, I'm going to play, I'm going to be exploitive until they can prove that they're paying attention. And it's not just by them saying stuff, it's by them actually making actions in the pot. The most defensible, I think, thing that players have done, or like their largest reactions to me, are everybody see changes to my left all the time. And then secondly, they will start 3-betting me more, but then just like we talk about, and for a long time, I remember when I first started getting coaching from you, like way back in the day, I was so uncomfortable with like the idea of 3-betting with hands outside of like ace king, ace queen, like those types of hands, because someone opened to 15, I'd make it 50, and all of a sudden there's $100 in the pot, and at the time I'd mine for $200, and the SPR is 2. So it just put me in a really uncomfortable spot. And now I'm to the point where, now I'm starting to 4-bet with hands that I wouldn't even 3-bet with. So now I'm taking a hand like King Jack suited, and I'm 4-betting that light 3-bet because I'm opening so much that their adjustment is to 3-bet. Now my adjustment is, as long as they've shown me that they're willing to 3-bet often, not just once every 3 hours, I will then start attacking them with 4-bets that are a little lighter. And then nobody 5-bet bluffs, at least in any game I've ever been a part of. Like in the most aggressive games, the best analogy I could always talk about in all the stream games I've played, the 5-10s, the 10-20s, in the most aggressive games, a 3-bet would happen as often as a common open, and a 4-bet would happen as often as a 3-bet. So it's still kind of common, but never a 5-bet, never. And that would be like the equivalent of like 4-betting. And they would just never see it. So I've just always kind of thought of it that way. They just have to prove to me that they can react to it. And then I kind of have a couple adjustments that I make, and it works out pretty well. But yeah, I think you nailed it again. You nailed it right on the head. The next thing I kind of want to tie into this. So live low stakes players don't play balanced, unbalanced. They don't play exploitive. They oftentimes are more on the random side or the chaotic side. Like randomly you'll open ace queen under the gun, you'll get 5 callers. Well, let's back up. A bunch of limpers to you maybe open pretty big with ace queen in late position. They all call, we're going to go 5 ways to a flop. That is 4-4 queen, and all of a sudden the under the gun player leads into the field into 4 or 5 people for half pot, and then maybe somebody calls and you're sitting there with top, or maybe you're sitting there with aces and you're like, what is going on? And I like to include that on maybe more of the chaotic side, where the villains in your hands take kind of ludicrous lines. Like, I think, Nick, you and I talked about a hand I played against somebody where there was probably $40 or $50, maybe 60 in the pot, and I think it led for 20 and they made it 300. Like those kind of like ridiculous plays that are pretty random, but I think they happen somewhat frequently. Like how many times have you ever seen like the old guy just rip $200 into a limped pot because he just want to get drawn out on, like the ridiculous kind of stuff? How does that factor in to being exploitive or being balanced in live low stakes?
I mean, I think that you're always going to have outliers. If you see any kind of like extreme sizing, unorthodox line, it's like something to take note of. But at the end of the day, we just go back to, honestly, this is why we advocate having like some kind of repeatable thought process to fall back on, where we range our opponent, and if we have enough info to accurately profile them as far as like what kind of player are they? Are they a loose passive recreational? Are they old man coffee, etc. If we have that info, then we can use that profile to skew our decision making. But if we don't, then that's why I've said for well over a decade now that you just basically go off a population read. And, for example, like if there's a spot where somebody massively overbets or they check raise to like a ridiculous number, like a 8 or 10x number, something that we might do actually, Tony. But that's very generally, or I would say that is most commonly never balanced. And our exploit in that spot, for example, would just be like significantly overfold. If we get situations where we have a 5-way field as a pre-flop aggressor and we have a lead and then a call, like it's, again, range our opponents, understand what we know about leads and donks in these types of games. And we talk about that more over at archshapepoker.com. That's something that you guys struggle a lot with, and we've talked about that in, I think, a previous episode, but that's something that would be covered much more in depth for a paid subscriber, somebody that's looking to seriously improve their game and their win rate. So, again, like you'd range them, and then you would make the best decision, and consider something that a lot of you guys don't do enough is like considering every option that's available to you. Like a lot of players will just get to a spot where they think it's just innately call or fold, and they don't consider raise. But I think just honestly going back to like ranging your opponents and understanding what types of plays the population makes in the common spots, and then if you do get the extreme or an outlier, range them the best you can, make a decision that makes sense based on the player profile or the population if need be, and just go from there. And you're not always going to get perfect info. It's not a game of perfect info. But yeah, Tony, anytime I see anything like extreme or really unorthodox, like I make note of it in that player, but I don't try to overcompensate, so to speak. Like I just go off of the player profile or the population. And a lot of times with the extremes, like the story kind of like usually checks out to like what you think it is. Like if they're putting in serious money relative to the stakes that you're playing, they tend to be significantly under bluffing. And there's many other spots that we could go over that are like that.
Yeah, I think the most clear example that I think applies to what you're saying was, so A is like, how should we instruct a live low stakes player to, if they have to interact with like really unorthodox play, would we tell them to adopt a balanced strategy? And just like you said, no, we want to adopt an exploitive strategy. And I think the most realistic way that I think I've seen people fumble this idea would be stuff like feeling like they have correct pot odds and they only have to be right 20% of the time for their call to be a profitable play, when in actuality that person who's making the bet has maybe the nittiest player, or they don't bluff, or they don't size up, or they don't do XYZ, and you might be that the hero might be sitting there with top two, with the low end of a straight, with middle set, or XYZ, and they're like, but my hand's just too strong to fold. It's like, in most circumstances, probably, yeah. But against this specific villain, against this line that he's taking, the profitable play is to fold. It's not about making the perfect balanced decision because you just have to be right 2 out of 10 times. It's very much in accordance with like the villain. What is the villain's tendencies? How do we exploitively get ahead of this person? If they're, like you say, Nick, if they're going to let us play perfect poker, then let them help us. Like, we don't want it to be tricky if it doesn't have to be. Like, who are we trying to prove our skill to? Like the random live low stakes players? Like no, not at all.
Right.
So I would also say, Nick, we want people. So if the idea was to say, how should somebody respond to perhaps all the random stuff that they see at 1-2, 1-3, or, we at Arch City Poker have taught them you're going to be checking when you're out of position, when you're the raise first in or the aggressor pre-flop more often than not. You're going to be betting most boards when you're in position as the pre-flop aggressor. But when we say to like blanket statement for a live low stakes player, and they see all the random stuff that happens at 1-2, 1-3, what would we say to like generally how should they respond to that? Should the idea of being exploitive, do they want to be value betting more? Do we want to kind of have some blanket statements for them to say, like, when you're trying to give more credit to aggression, then like not everybody's bluffing. It's not a television show. Like Not everybody who's barreling all three streets is going to be like, do 7 and then flip it over. What
Right.
would you be telling like somebody who's trying to dive in and maybe bombarded with unorthodox play all the time and they're just not sure like what lane to stay in? What would we want to tell that person?
I mean, if you fall back on our baseline strategies we suggest, they will put you in a position where I think like even facing the rare unorthodox line or sizing won't be like too much of a problem. I like if go back to like population tendencies or reads. Like if there's a spot where somebody triple barrels, they're significantly under bluffing. Let's say they let's say they c bet flop, but it's for like 1.5x pot, significantly under bluffed and not balanced. Like we would just fold a large portion of our range, except everything like near the top, basically. I think just keeping it exploitive, but again, like ranging your opponents, attack cap ranges. Don't overexpose yourselves with too large sizings or too many, or betting or raising too frequently when your opponent is essentially not capped. Like that's something you could go off as capped versus uncapped. But like I think that to make it clear to you guys, like we're kind of just like trying to like cover all the aspects of like, and that includes like some of the random or unorthodox things you'll see. But for the most part, like the live low stakes players all kind of play the same way. Like they're gonna try to get in and speculate. They're gonna try to play pull the lever on the slot machine or play bingo, so to speak, and hit a hand. And they'll worry about their hand, or if they're a level above that, their range. But most of you need to get out of that sphere of thinking and put yourself in the sphere of what does my opponent have? What does his sizing or line indicate to us? And range him from pre-flop to flop, turn to river, street to street, keep building upon that range, and then make a decision. For example, if I can come up with like a really unorthodox or kind of crazy line off the top of my head, like if let's say my opponent bets flop, checks back turn, and then bets like a brick river after we check to him for 2x. Yes, 2x is a very under bluff situation for those games, right? But if let's say the player profile is somebody that is capable of bluffing or they are like kind of bad aggressive, that line usually like is pretty empty. Like if they bet, check back, and then over bet and nothing had changed from the flop to turn to river, then that's a spot where I've ranged my opponent correctly, determined that he's capped after the turn check back in all likelihood, and then we're able to make a profitable bluff catch. And bluff catch is not how we make a ton of our money at all in the low stakes game. It actually comes from bluffing a ton ourselves and then value betting thin value where people aren't getting it. But yeah, Tony, I think just range them, figure out if they're capped or uncapped, and put the pieces of the puzzle together. And even the most like unorthodox or ridiculous lines, like they'll make some sense to you or enough sense based on how you think the population acts based on that sizing or that frequency, and then you can make a profitable decision. And you're not always going to be right. Like let's say I call in that spot and then he shows me like a huge hand. Well, I'll make note of it that player is capable of having a big hand in that spot, depending on, like how he got there, of course. But like you just take notes and you keep building upon the player profile. And if it's until you get that info, though, you just need to go off of like your ability to range them and if they're capped or uncapped and what you know about the population and their tendencies.
Yeah, I think you brought up a lot of good points, and I think it's having like a playbook of stuff that you need to refine and look at to properly like diagnose a hand, more or less. I didn't think if a lot of players at live low stakes, they're not doing that. They're just looking at their two cards. We talk about this all the time. They're looking at their two cards, they're looking at the board, and then maybe they're looking at stack sizes or bet sizes, or maybe trying to recall back on player histories, kind of on the fly. They weren't paying attention, so they have to like actually stop and think about it. But I see that kind of stuff all the time, and I always just kind of think to myself, like, like what are we thinking about here? This seems pretty basic spot. Like what are we doing?
Yeah. And I think a
So
lot of guys that like a lot of you guys that are listening and for example, like kind of taking this, I don't know if I'd say a step further, but like expanding upon this that because I think a lot of you do this where like you'll bet and not even as the preflop aggressor, and that's not like we've learned through solvers now over the years that the preflop initiative is not as important as people make it out to be. And no limit, it still is most of the time important because you do tend to have um like range and nut advantage if you want to get GTO, but like it goes back more to like nut advantage and like there are certain spots where the aggressor is not the one that has to be like you can like lead into the aggressor in some of these spots, but like what I'm getting at is I'll see guys in live low stakes games. They will, let's say, defend or call out of the big blind against like let's say like a button raise or whatever, and then they will lead out on let's say Queen 7-4 and player in position will fold. They'll show Queen Jack, whatever, right? Top pair. And I think a lot of players will, in that spot, you guys will bet out and then think about like why you did it after the fact. Like there aren't enough of you that are thinking about why you're taking the action that you are. And in that spot, I would ask that player, like, what were you thinking? Like, why did you bet? And most players would say, well, I had top pair. Like, I want to get value. I want to get protection. But it's like, but are you allowed to do that? Do you understand, like, that if you're, like, what does that accomplish? Like, is that the best line? What happens if you check? Like, how does your opponent react to that? If you bet, how does it react to that? And, like, a lot of you guys aren't getting anywhere close to this. And so that's why it's important to range your opponent pre-flop to flop, and then you can make these decisions. But I think the point I'm making is that a lot of you guys are getting caught up in making a play and then thinking about it after. And you need to reverse that. You need to think and then take the line. And a lot of you would be a lot better off right away without honestly needing a trained site like archcitypoker.com, although the vast majority of you do need it and you should come visit us. But yeah, Tony, I think they need to reverse that line of thinking. They need to think about what their actions are going to accomplish, all of them, like, and then take a line instead of reversing it, which I'm still surprised this day at the vast majority of players do this. They take an action and then they reason it out loud with the guy next to them, or they try to like justify it after the fact. It doesn't make any sense at all.
yeah, it's almost like imagine a game where you're not allowed to do anything until you can explain why you're doing it.
Yeah.
What kind of game would that look like at live low stakes? Like,
Yeah.
and I don't think I think hardly the population could highlight why they're doing half the things that they're doing. I mean, outside of like visual cues, like there's the letter A in my hand and there's a letter A on the board. That must mean
Yeah.
like
No, that's exactly what it is. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. When I first, like 4 iterations of Arch City Poker ago, long time ago, the first blog that I ever wrote, the article on the site was like, it essentially had to do with like understanding why you're making a bet, like why your reasoning for why had top pair is not good enough. Like there needs to be more to it than that. And I think for a lot of players, it seems overwhelming or like or more complex than it needs to be. But that's what we do over at Arch State Poker is that we simplify that for you and we make you understand, we help you understand like why we're thinking about all the options and how we get to the best line, how we get to the most profit line. And are you going to get there every time? No, but you're going to get way closer to that than what you were without our help before that.
Yeah. I think it's a good thing. For most of the types of players that Nick you've worked with that have subscribed to Arch City Poker, what would you say were maybe some of their biggest leaks and perhaps some of the largest leaks that were the most easily fixed? Just kind of not like specific stuff, but maybe more like general stuff. What would you say were some of the most common leaks that were maybe fixed when they either you did some one-on-one coaching with them or they were a subscriber to archcitypoker.com?
Sure. Yeah. If we're talking about specifically live low stakes players, clean up the pre-flop game first and foremost. It sets everything else up post-flop. If you're messing up too much pre-flop, you're setting yourself up to fail post-flop. Pre-flop to post-flop, if you will. If we're talking about specifically post-flop, understanding simple concepts like stack to pot ratio, and then maybe the most important to me, again, is it's a combination of two things, but it's stop worrying about your own hand or your range if you're getting to that level, and go right away to ranging your opponent and figuring out where they're at. And if you can do that, and a lot of players play with their cards basically face up, especially by the time you get to turn and river, where the real money's made. If you can do that, then you can come back to, okay, well, how does my hand fit into this? Like we kind of talked about those three tiers or those three buckets. Like, do I have value? Do I have showdown value? Or like middling equity? And then do I have, essentially like a fold, or do I have a bluffing candidate in that third bucket? But understanding where your opponent is at first and foremost, learning how to range your opponent, how to hand read and progress through the street and build upon that and narrow their range down. If you can do that, you will beat the vast majority of games that you play in. And so that's what I have always worked with players, whether it's no limit or PLO, teach them how to range their opponent and go through kind of a repeatable thought process. And it doesn't have to be overly complicated outside of that. We just kind of add these little building blocks and go from there. And it's pretty simple.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I think one of the more foundational things that people who've inquired, and I've worked with people, and the largest thing the first thing we've actually covered is if I had to ask you, like, describe to me all the villains at your table, like they can maybe name one, maybe two. They can't really describe anything about them, not their play style, not their nothing, no tendencies, bet sizing stuff. They're just reacting like on the fly, and they're only remembering the stuff that they were specifically involved with. They're not observing the table to see some great information of what's being displayed when like two hands go heads up and they show each other their hands. And I think that's just so important. And if you
it's huge. Yeah. Bet sizing tells, frequency tells, like, does this person ever check back top pair or better? Do they, when they bet small on the river, like, what does that mean? Or when they bet large, what does that mean? And that goes, like, I know that we specialize, like, in cash games, but, like, that's why, like, early in tournaments, I see people kind of, like, on their phones or they're kind of, I don't know, like, messing around. And, like, that's the time to build player profiles at your table, because you could be with these people for a long time and you can pick up tells that matter so much more when you get to like the middle stages of a tournament, for example. So like, yeah, Tone, I think that's a huge thing for me, is that I implore players to pay attention when they're not in the hand themselves. Do you need to catch every little thing and use that kind of mental energy? No, but like, I think that the vast majority of you, like, you're BSing outside of it. And I understand, like, look, if you're watching this and you're just trying to get a little bit better and like you go and you want to socialize or you just want to gamble, it's a way to blow off steam. We encourage that too. That's fine. But for you guys that are serious about improving your win rate, becoming a better player, becoming more comfortable with your game, like, you need to pay attention to stuff like that, and you need to take it serious, and you need to dial in. Like, that's what the best players do. And so, yeah, there's just, for me, like, there's no excuse to not be paying attention to what the players are doing at your table and be able to build these profiles.
I 100% agree, right? So like, you're not supposed to be playing cards against villains and then trying to figure stuff out on the fly. Like, I've done that a million times, and I can tell you that you will then become a player like me that is like great strategy against the wrong person. That is my MO. So, and that's just because, maybe I wasn't paying attention to the table, or I wasn't being as aware of my surroundings as maybe I should have been. And I don't know. It's just one of the most important things. Like, yes, pre-flop and everything is like the foundational basic stuff, but I think if we can't even pay attention to who the villains are at the table, like what are we doing? Right? But yeah, Nick, so that's going to wrap up episode 22 of the Arch City Poker podcast. And I think we had a fantastic topic this week. And again, if you're brand new to Arch City Poker, go on and like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel and our podcast. We're going to work to get it on Spotify. We're going to get it up on Apple. We've gotten a lot of requests to get it in more places than just YouTube here. So we're gonna work on doing that for everybody. And Nick, do you have any final words for anybody?
Yeah, I'll say real quick, I think something that I get asked a lot when it comes to this topic is, like what would be a sign or like a situation where you decide you need to revert back to some kind of balance or the baseline against like a regular, like players that you play with a lot? Because Tony, to be honest, like it's been brought to my attention that even like more of our local regulars are watch or listening to this podcast, and they're consuming our content, and that's great. Like I want you guys to get better. I think it's good for our room, for example, and for all you guys across the US or whatever that are starting to take in this content. I'll say that if you are a very good player, this is why it pays to understand and have put in the work off table to understand the baseline a little bit. Like, I'll give you an example. If a regular now knows that I'm betting range in position on most every board for them, like it's most boards, and they, can they do I think they're capable of countering that like correctly? Will they, for example, start adding in like more check raises, right? The biggest thing, Tony, that I would tell these guys that are looking to make these simple adjustments is if you can anticipate it, and it takes kind of some experience to do this, but this is why it's important that I think you listen to what people are saying at the table, see how they're playing, what they're saying about you, like what others are saying at the table to each other about you. Like that can happen, especially if you are like one of the better known players or more aggressive players at the table. If you can anticipate it and then just be one step ahead of them, that's the key. So like if somebody knew I was betting range and position and they wanted to add more check raises, like I just add a little more, like just even a little bit of polarization, and I start checking back some stuff that doesn't want to face check raise. So like it's simple things like that, guys. Like if you are go 100% exploitive. If there's a rare scenario where you think you need to add a little bit of balance, then you just sprinkle in some stuff that you know to be right from GTO. And if you don't know that, then it pays to get involved a little with the solver. We talk about it a little bit on the site and how to adjust, but stay exploitive and really get after these guys in that way.
Yeah, and for the cherry on top, I would say that, I think people as well are perhaps adjusting a little bit, but I don't think they're having the correct adjustments either, right? So they would know that I'm betting more often than not in position, in heads up or maybe three-way pots, but instead of like a check raise, they're just overcalling too much now. So, and then they're just capping themselves, and then I can make, then we can put them in an uncomfortable spot on the turn, or maybe we can check back and really protect our hand if we need to. But the reactions aren't appropriate because the foundations aren't there, and I think that's a big kind of mistake. Is even if you know what somebody's doing, if you don't know why they're doing it, your adjustments aren't going to be accurate because you don't know why they're doing what they're doing. You're just reacting to the bet size versus understanding why they're betting. So I think that's why it's so important to just understand the fundamentals and the basics and come on over to archcitypoker.com, because it's not just enough to know that aces are good and like, why do you bet them? When aren't they good? What bet sizings do we want to use? In position, out position, multi-way, monotone, dynamic, static, like all the things. So, but yeah. All right, Nick. That's going to wrap up episode 22. Again, like, share, and subscribe. Head on over to archcitypoker.com, and we will see you next week. Thanks, everybody.